Greetings, friends! Wantingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the 2 weeks of May 11th through May 24th of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Sorry for what we have 2 weeks instead of 1 week this time. I was out I was at the EDC Music Festival, and then I got really sick, and I'm still sick to this day. So it's been a week, and I'm still sick. So it's been a bit of a doozy. So if I been sniffing or anything like that, I apologize. But we have lots of things to go over. And one of the biggest, and we're going to begin in the Zaporizhia direction, just the general Zaporizhia area, and beginning on the more western side. And now there's good news for the Ukrainians, and then there's good news for the Russians, and then henceforth bad news for each side. So we're going to begin on the western side, which is where the good news for the Ukrainians is coming through. And this week, in these last 2 weeks in May, the Ukrainians have completely routed the Russians in their forward, from their gains that they've been accumulating in the 2025. We're talking about, the Russians, going up to taking almost all of Primorska and even entering Rechny. We're talking about, the Russians trying to capture this localized high ground, of Novolinovka, Leukemia, Molodelinovka, and Polovka, and so forth. And we're talking about how the Ukrainians. And, it's a bit of a hush-hush. Again, the Ukrainians have kind of learned their lesson where they don't announce that there's a counterattack. And I think it actually does that's a very smart move, because when there's no online hype about it, no one knows what's going on. And then that way, it's only the people on the ground, and if the people on the ground are incompetent and don't want to report about the losses to their commanders, then that's when bad things will happen. So, the Ukrainians are actually being pretty quiet about it, but most mappers and even some geolocations have been showing that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians all the way back and have almost recaptured the town of Stepnohirsk. Specifically, most mappers agree that they have specifically taken the more important part, this kind of built up high-rise building area of the central part of Stepnohirsk, which allows them to be able to accumulate more soldiers here more easily. Along with this, the Russians were pushed back to the Sherbriki-Stepova line here, and back to Kupyansk as well. Now, the thing about Stepnohirsk is that the Russians are also still in control of the southern citadel, this area right here. If you recall, a year ago or so, this is what they had to take in the first place before they had to take Stepnohirsk. But they're still in control of this citadel here. So the Russians could hold on to the citadel. They'll still have some sort of bridgehead here. Along with this, most mappers have shown that most of Primorsk has been retaken by the Ukrainians. Now, some mappers are saying the Russians are still, in Stepnohirsk, still in the southern part of Primorska. Again, it's very hard to know what's what. But a lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians are still on the push here, and we don't know how much they're going to continue pushing the Russians out. It seems like the main goal here is to retake everything the Russians took in their Zaporizhia offensive here, which means, taking back, pushing the Russians back to the other side, on the other side of the river near Kamyanska, probably taking back Stepova, Meloshebriki, and then pushing the Russians back to kind of this area right here. Now, once they do that, then the Ukrainians could stop. They don't have to push anymore. Because if they could, a lot of sources are, some hype people are like, oh, if they continue pushing towards Vasilivka, which is a very big logistics node, they could continue pushing and breaking into Mykolaievka here, and they could start breaking into the lines of the Russians. The thing is that at that point, then the Russians will be able to then have their flanks exposed. The thing with the Russians being up in the north here, let's say at the furthest extent that the Russians were claiming, like this, right, is that the Ukrainians were able to do counterattacks on this kind of exposed salient, and now when the Russians are pushed back here, the Ukrainians can't hit them from the side anymore. They only could do direct attacks, which is very, very costly. And I don't think they will continue pushing. I think the main reason for this attack to push is that, because as I mentioned before, is that this push here from the Russians is in tandem with the Russian push here, which is to encircle the town of Orekov. As you can see, if the Russians were not pushed back here, and they were able to hold on to their gains kind of in this area, they would have been able to continue developing their offensive, maybe towards Kumashevaka, towards Yuryivka, and been able to link up with the Russian push that's coming from the east here, and do a big encirclement of Orekov. However, with the push here, while the Russians are not are, we're going to talk about this in a moment, are, even if the Russians manage to cut the highway here, the Ukrainians will still be able to have this highway, and Orekov will be in a much more secure position to be held out for a bit of a longer time. And it's very essential the Ukrainians hold on to Orekov so that the Russians don't have a huge logistics node so that they continue pushing towards Zaporizhia itself. So, I do think that the right now the battles are going to continue going on for Stepnohirsk. I think the Ukrainians, if they are pushing here, they're gonna, and if the Russians don't stop them, is they will try to retake Stepnohirsk, retake this citadel here, and maybe even go back to Kupyansk. But that will be the extent of it. It will be basically reverting back to the status quo. Very bad news for the Russians, but there won't be some sort of big offensive, in my estimation, to try to like break through here. It'll return back to where the front line was before. But yeah, very good news for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are still holding on to this localized high ground with these villages here. They've pushed the Russians back from this canal here and from Primorska. They're re-entering Stepnohirsk. So now it's just a matter of where will what more progress will the Russians be? Will the Ukrainians be showing in this area? We shall see. But definitely make it a bit of a more painful process to take Orekha for the Russians as they're pushing here. Now, as we continue developing about Zaporizhia, now there's good news for the Russians, and it's on this more eastern side of Zaporizhia here in this area right here. And in these last 2 weeks, the Russians have made a lot of decent progress. This, usually because of the Ukrainian counteroffensive that happened here in the spring, it's been very, very back and forth, tug of war, and it's very not a lot of things have happened. But these last 2 weeks, the Russians have been finally gaining the initiative here. The biggest news is that the Russians have completely captured the town of Verkhotursk. They have showed themselves raising their flags in this area, so this is a very good big village that the Russians can use to accumulate forces. I wouldn't be surprised that the next goal for the Russians, they will continue using the tree lines to push towards the town of Kopany, Dnipropetrovsk, and Ravinia. Secure themselves in this point right here. And then as they push here, they will also be pushing from the south here towards the town of Vozhyanka, which is one of the last big Ukrainian defense nodes on the Gancha River. Remember, one of the biggest goals of the Ukrainian offensive here was to push the Russians back on the other side of the Gancha River here. And they weren't able to, how do you say it? They were, because the Gancha River was the last line of strong Ukrainian defenses, and they really didn't want the Russians to be able to cross it. They wanted to push them back. But despite slowing down the Russians, they've not kicked them out, and now the Russians are slowly but surely accumulating more and more forces here, and actually pushing. And not only that, they've captured also, talking of Vozhyanka, they've taken about half of the town here. We have geolocation showing that at least, sorry, that the central part of Russians being in the central part of Vozhyanka here. So I wouldn't actually be surprised that maybe by the end of May even that the Russians take this town and then use Vozhyanka and Verkhotursk as like a staging point to continue their offensive towards the main goal, which is this highway which connects Orekov and so forth. But again, that does not mean Orekov will be completely cut off. They'll still have this highway, but once they take this highway, then they'll be able to start pushing, continuously just enveloping Orekha from the north here. Along with this, we basically, most sources are saying that the Russians are still in control of Ternavata here. They're holding up here. Now, the big question here is, what's the status of the town of Rizhdanivka, this town right here? Now, remember, we've had geolocations of the Russians being here. The Russians claim they've taken it. The thing is that we've also had geolocations of the Ukrainians being there, so it's a bit of a gray zone. And so the Ukrainians, the Russians really need to reestablish themselves in Rizhdanivka, and then they could then have a very strong front line, something like this. So then they'll have a very solid bridgehead on the other side of the Gancha River, and so Syriac map actually kind of already has it here, but this area right here is where the this red line that I wrote is where the river is. So as you can see, once the Russians capture everything on this red line that I've shown here, then this makes a very solid bridgehead for the Russians here. A bit more to the south here, the Russians have also completely captured the town of Chevron here, this village right here. Very good news for the Russians. And along with this, we had geolocations of the Russians being right in the eastern part of Dnipropetrovsk. Remember, before we've had geolocations of the Russians acting in these fields all around Dnipropetrovsk here. So I wouldn't be surprised that also within this month that the Russians take Dnipropetrovsk very soon. And since there's now greenery everywhere, the Russians will be able to secure themselves in these tree lines here. And this also helps secure their southern flank as they push towards here. Now, the main goal for the Russians here is to kind of do these village hopping all the way toward the town of Omelette here, because taking Omelette will be the kind of the main kind of goal, kind of prize to cut off Orekov here. But yeah, so very, as you can see now, the Russians are back on the fight here on the initiative, and we shall see how that develops. If we look more towards kind of this Dnipropetrovsk area, it's a bit more of again, very fluid. It's not a lot of changes. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are reactivate here, trying to like reestablish themselves here. We actually, right as I was like taking notes for this video, I actually was looking at Telegram. We had a geolocation showing the Russians being in Verbova, for example. But then also a few days before, we had geolocations of the Ukrainians, for example, being in Kostyantynivka here. So, again, it's very fluid. There's no solid front line. I don't want to repeat myself all the time, but this is a very fluid. The front line is not a solid. It's not like, for example, there's 100% Russians in Radish and 100% Ukrainians in Nekabivka. There could be Ukrainian infiltrations of Radish, just as there could be Russian infiltrations of Dnipropetrovsk, for example. It's very fluid. But again, what the Russians will probably want to do is to have a more secure area along this area right here. So if the Russians could hold on to this area, they could protect the northern flank a lot better. Though, I think what the main thing for the Russians will have to do is, I think they're going to focus on trying to take Orekov, and then once they take Orekov, then the focus will be on like a northern push. I don't think they're going to push towards Zaporizhia. I think they're going to push towards trying to take Pokrovsky, Prozny, Novomykolaievka, and secure their northern flank here a lot better, so that then when they push towards Zaporizhia, because they need to secure this northern flank, because if they want to siege Zaporizhia, they'll have to siege it from the north, and in order to siege it, they'll have to be taking this area right here. So I do think that this will be another axis of Russian advance soon. Alrighty. All right, now we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction. There's not been that much changes in this area. The biggest news is that basically the Russians have completely captured the town of Vasilivka here. We talked about how they took the town of Nova Alexandrivka last time. Now they've taken Vasilivka. Another good news for the Russians. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue to develop their offensive towards the town of Myrnia here, this area right here. So I wouldn't be surprised if that continues being developed here. But the thing is that as the Russians push beyond this Grishny area, again, then they'll expose themselves to to attack. So I actually think that maybe they'll take Myrnia as like a forward base, but then after that, I think they'll then focus on trying to move from the fields towards the town of Shevchenko, and it's these villages to the south of Dobropillya are just the Russians really need to accumulate force, and it helps the Ukrainians because there's nothing between like the Russian accumulation places in Minograd and Pokrovsk versus here. So it's to move from here all the way to here, it's going to expose them, and the Ukrainians have a lot of areas to help defeat them. The Russians probably right at the moment are just trying to secure themselves a bit more better here. We've had more and more geolocations of the Russians being in these kind of fields to the west of Grishny, to the west of Pokrovsk here. So it's just basically just improving their positions here. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing a battle for Sigirivka here, which will protect their, this is just to protect their flanks a little bit. But it does seem like the Russians have kind of deprioritized this sector. We also had more geolocations showing that the Ukrainians are more in control of Belitska than we've originally assumed. So it does seem like, while the battle, I'm not ruling out there's probably still Russian DRGs in there. The Ukrainians are still holding on to Belitska, which is good news for them for their overall defense. Besides that, nothing else much in Dobropillya. But in the Kostiantynivka direction, we have a lot of interesting things, and this is probably going to be the first big town that's going to fall for the Russians in 2026. And you know, we talked about how the Russians broke into Konstantinivka last time, and this week there's no different. This week, the Russians have completely, you know, a lot of sources are saying that the Russians are just breaking into this kind of giant citadel of the southern part of Konstantinivka and are actually securing themselves here. And that the Ukrainians that are in this kind of low-rise area right here are being encircled on multiple areas. We had geolocations of the Russians being in this, like, you know, industrial zone right in the central part of Konstantinivka. So it seems like what the Russians are doing is just continuously just clearing the basements here, continuously pushing, clearing more and more until they finally secure themselves fully up until the Kharkiv Terets River here. And then this actually cuts off the Ukrainians here. Now you might be wondering, you know, maybe they try, but you know, leave here. But the thing is that it's, you know, there's no direct route. You know, it's across a river. You know, all the bridges have been blown up, so it's very, very hard to secure, you know, to supply your positions here. So I actually wouldn't be surprised that once the Russians, you know, we're at this critical mass point where the Russians force the Ukrainians to, you know, retreat, and then they completely secure themselves on everything underneath the river of the Kharkiv Terets River in Konstantinivka. And then this will give the Russians a huge built-up area to continue funneling in soldiers and then continue pushing. Now, we've also had more and more of, so it's kind of like, you know, like it's like a mini encirclement in this area right here. Now, also in this northern part of Konstantinivka, we've had some very interesting updates. So this map doesn't show it, but most mappers are actually saying that the Russians are actually in full control of Dnipropetrovsk. And not only that, we've had not just one, I think we've had up to 3 geolocations of the Russians being in the town of Molocharovka. Now, this could be DRGs. I actually do think it is DRGs. But the thing is, showing that the Russians are active right, you know, in this area right here shows that, you know, the Russians are probably more and more insecure of Dnipropetrovsk than we think. We also had another geolocation of the Russians being right here, for example. Now, you know, you could say that, you know, all these infiltrations of this kind of northern part of Konstantinivka is just DRGs. That could be the case. The thing is that once the Russians are fully securing themselves in the southern part of Konstantinivka, they're going to be in a much greater position to be able to actually secure themselves here. And then, you know, be able to, like, hold, you know, do something like this as well. So then take all this. Now, you know, so it does look like the Russians are, you know, doing this, like, the height of the battle for Konstantinivka. Now, the thing is that this kind of western part of Konstantinivka, this northern sector right here, is an area where the Ukrainians can actually still put up a bit of a fight. So the Russians might actually be able to take the central part of Konstantinivka. But, you know, in terms of taking the rest of it, the Ukrainians will be able to keep, you know, their supply situation here is a lot more secure, and so, you know, they're going to continue denying Konstantinivka has been taken, especially if the Russians aren't able to clear out this giant, you know, trench-filled area here, where the Ukrainians could use it to counterattacks into where they'll be able to do DRG activities to enter this area of Konstantinivka, which I'm assuming which they will do. Once the Russians claim they've taken the central part of Konstantinivka, you know, the Ukrainians will be in these, like, trenches here to try to, you know, enter here. So it's very, very, you know, there's still a lot of work to do, you know, just because, you know, I think taking Konstantinivka, you know, is a, you know, a big, it will be a very big, you know, achievement for the Russians, but there's still so much to do. The Russians still have to clear out Dovobalka, they have to clear out Chevron, Mykolaievka, Stinky, and, you know, then once they clear out, you know, these giant trench networks here and everything like that, then they could be able to secure Konstantinivka. It's just there's so much more to things to do, and you know, just because, you know, we're now seeing the Russians battling for the Konstantinivka, taking a huge part of it, but there's so much more to do there. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Slavyansk direction once my computer decides to stop shitting itself. Luckily, I am actually getting a custom-built PC soon, so hopefully my laptop of death, which is going to is combusting at the seams, and yeah, I mean, look at this shit, like, it's just dead, completely fucking dead. Yeah, anyway, so here's the Slavyansk direction. Let's talk about it once it decides to want to load here. Just, you know, anytime. Anyway, so here we go. So the biggest news in the Slavyansk direction is the Russians are securing themselves in the Krylovka-Kalinivka line. We talked about how the Russians took Krylovka last time. Now the big question is the Russians are now battling for these kind of hills uh, to the west of them. They're still battling for them, so just classes continue going for these hills. Along with this, the Russians are, securing themselves in these kind of like fields that are to the south of Ray Alexandrivka. However, the Ukrainians are not sleeping; they are doing counterattacks. Obviously, they're defending here. They did a counterattack that led them to the northern part of Nikiforivka as well. So it's the Ukrainians are definitely trying to hold on to Ray Alexandriivka. This is the most important node of defense for this entire Slavyansk direction, and if they lose it, it'll be very, very bad news for them. The Russians are slowly but surely putting their claws around it, but the Ukrainians are trying to push them back. But slow but sure progress is going on. The Russians are also continuously expanding the gray zone. They're holding themselves up in Fyrodovka in the Prilivka Minkivka line. But along with this, not only are they holding on here, they're sending DRGs beyond the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. So the canal is kind of like the main border, which the Russians are using as the defense. But we've also had a lot of mappers are saying DRGs are now active in Tynivka and Malinovka. Not that they secure themselves here. It's just that there's Russian DRGs active in these areas, showing just breaking up the defenses and showing if there's any weaknesses here, because if they could take Malinovka and Tanivka, this will be a good forward operating base towards Kramatorsk. Anyway, but yeah, that's basically it for the Slavyansk direction. In the Lyman direction, we actually have some there was an interesting thing that happened a few days ago, so that the Ukrainians went on the offensive here. So in the Lyman direction, the Ukrainians are basically on the offensive, but it's actually kind of small potatoes. There's not actually been that much stuff. The biggest thing is in two directions. One in the southern part. Again, the southern part is a big gray zone. So for example, the Ukrainians are doing these counterattacks to try to re-enter Orozhina and Dubrova, and just as, for example, we've had geolocation of the Russians being in this in the southern part of Lyman and in these forests here, we also had the Ukrainians also trying to push the gray zone back towards Dubrova and Orozhina and even Yampil in some cases. So it's definitely the Ukrainians aren't sleeping. That doesn't mean the Russians are pushed back from the southern part of Lyman. They're still holding on here. It's just that the Ukrainians aren't letting the Russians secure themselves on, say, in this area, and then instead of fighting for these two villages, the fighting will be back towards these two villages, which helps the Ukrainians because they really don't want to give up Lyman. In the northern part here, the Ukrainians are also still doing attacks, trying to push the Russians out of these tree lines to the northern part of Lyman, where we talked about the Russians were in this northern part of Lyman, but it looks like they pushed them back to the town of Stavky. This probably also explains why Dobropillya, which we had geolocations of the Russians being in the central part like a month or two ago. Yeah, maybe like 2 months ago. But the thing is that we didn't get any more updates. It seems like the Ukrainians have done a counterattack here to try to push the Russians out of Dobropillya, but we don't know the exact situation of what's going on there. And then also in the more northern part here, we had a geolocation of the Ukrainians doing a counterattack towards the town of Novi here and Rikadup. So it was I think even an armored counterattack from around the Novomiriya area, and then right in the Kharkov Donetsk border region, around this area right here. My computer is deciding to shit itself at this moment for whatever reason. Yeah, right there. Around this area, we had the Ukrainian tank being exploded. The Russians are saying that this counterattack got thwarted and they got defeated, but it does show that the Ukrainians are really trying to defeat the Russians here, because the Russians have a very good situation going around Kharkovka, Rekidup, and Nova in this northern salient here. And if the Ukrainians could take Novi, remember they were contesting Rekidup for a long while, but if they could, especially if they could take Novi, that would be a very, very bad news for the Russians. That would really harm their defenses in this Lyman salient here. But we shall see how that develops there. So that's it for the Lyman direction. Just a little bit before we go on to Kupyansk, the Russians claim they took Borova. This just shows that this entire western group, which is in charge from Kupyansk down to Lyman, is just a bunch of hogwash and bullshit. they really need to sack the commander who's in charge here. Just complete, the guy who's in charge of this entire Western military district is just a complete liar, and or at the very least, the people in charge of all the units here are just complete garbage. So they just need a, there's something in the Oska River that makes the Russians completely retarded. Anyway, in the Kupyansk direction, we have had more and more geolocations, basically confirming that the Russians are basically have secured themselves in this kind of like eastern part of Kupyansk Volshinoye here, in this area here. It's a big question of what's going on in this kind of like small built-up area right here, but I'm pretty certain the Russians are probably about to take this as well. Remember, we've had continuously geolocations of the Russians being in Kupyansk Volshinoye here, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians actually are secure themselves a lot more better there. We had another geolocation that actually just came out of the Russians being in this area right here, so it does show that the eastern part of Kupyansk is still under Russian control here. So most mappers are now updating, showing that Petropavlovka and such is under Russian control, but we already knew that. I also would put Kucheriivka is under Russian control as well. You could say Polonia is is a gray zone still, because this like kind of part of Kupyansk is still not under Russian control. I wonder why the Russians aren't like trying to accumulate forces in this kind of like eastern part of Kupyansk and just like continuously just pushing down along the river. I wonder why they're not doing that. But yeah, so but we did get geolocation that the Ukrainians of the Ukraine still being in Kisharovka and Novosolonia, for example. So the one area of the Ukrainians are still like having a bridgehead here, despite what the Russians claim, is that there's still a bridgehead on the Kupyansk side of the Oska River. It's kind of more geared towards. Let me just kind of zoom out here if I can, if my computer will let me. If you will let me, please. Yes, if you could allow me to, and stop kind of looking like you're from 1922 trying to run something. There we go. And if it's something like, yeah, like right here. So this is where there's actually a strong Ukrainian bridgehead on the Oska River here. So they're holding on here. But the northern part in Kupyansk Volshinoye and the rest of Kupyansk is very much in a very precarious situation still. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Kharkov area. The Ukrainians did a mini counterattack and retook the town of Ordotnya. I think the Ukrainians are raising their flags here. Again, this shows that all these villages the Russians took here, I actually wouldn't be surprised that if there's no Russians in Dobropillya, Bolivka, in Chunanivka. Milova is I actually think a pretty decent sized village, so I think there's probably some Russians here. But the thing is that these villages here, there's just I had this hunch, but there's just nothing there, and the only reason the Ukrainians don't attack is just there's no reason to. So it's just a giant gray zone. But I do think I don't know why the Ukrainians decided to do a attack there to to raise the flag here, but it's basically just a lot of these border villages that they take are just they take it just for PR purposes, and that's it. So it does show that it's not as secure as you would think. Now, in the more northern Volchansk area, we actually had some very interesting updates happening here. We actually had a geolocation of the Russians crossing the river here and actually raising their flags all over the town of Volka-Ivka here, and also in Chakivka here. So this is a very good news for the Russians. They're just continuously expanding their gray zone more. I mean, their border zone more and more. Before we had geolocation of the Russians being in Okarivka. We had we talked about how the Russians are now expanding their foothold all over here. So this kind of line of villages from Berkdarvka all the way to Volchansk here, this kind of line of villages will be a very good kind of forward operating base for the Russians, so that they could then push towards Belikoladovsky here. So, lots of good news for the Russians here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, secure themselves fully in this area. But they do definitely need to pick up the pace in this kind of northern part here. But I wouldn't be surprised that, within this summertime, they secure themselves full in all these villages here and then push the Ukrainians back. So, lots of good news happening for the Russians here. Crossing the river here, taking Volkolivka, Chekivka. I think Russians are also saying they're now about to take Karichna here, but that's not been confirmed 100% yet. Now, where the Ukrainians are making some interesting progress is that we actually had geolocation of the Ukrainians being in Stepnohirsk and Lyman, for example, being bombed. So this shows that it's DRG activity. Now, but we also had, for example, mappers saying that the Russians are also now in the town of Shesterivka here, this village right here. So it seems like the Russians are now, trying to break into this area right here. But it does show that. This area is still very much in a fluid. So it does seem like the battle for Vilcha is still ongoing. Some mappers are saying that the town has been recaptured by the Ukrainians. I don't think that's the case, but a lot of mappers are saying that the Vilcha was recaptured by the Ukrainians, and that's how they've been able to infiltrate these two areas. That actually might make sense. The thing is, we just need more data for what's happening here. We also had the Ukrainians doing a counterattack and re-entering the town of Zaporizhia. We had a Ukrainian POW getting captured here, and so it's definitely a giant, very fluid here. So the Ukrainians are counterattacking in this kind of more western part of Volchansk, and then on the more kind of northern border, it seems like they're still actually making more progress in terms of for the Russians. But we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Sorry for my computer being absolute fucking dog shit and just completely completely unprepared to do any sort of work whatsoever. But I hope you guys enjoyed despite me being sick, but despite all the things against us, we have made it to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will continue doing these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates, even if they're every 2 weeks or so now, because of just how slow the battle has been going, because after the turnoff of Starlink, just the Russians have been very slow, and the Ukrainians are now doing massive counterattacks. So the Russians attack, and then the Ukrainians push them back, so it's just like nothing gets gained, nothing gets lost, so it's just very hard to know what's going on. And yeah, we shall, but I'll continue doing these updates, maybe every week, maybe every 2 weeks, we shall see. But yeah, hopefully just subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian updates. Like this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this awesome. Just have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.